An HPC system or computer cluster typically follows this basic layout. The green lines in this diagram are the network connections between the various components. These are not necessarily the same speed or even the same medium. They are very often different between the various cluster components. We'll be representing our cluster head node with this head icon. The management node will be this stock photo, and it has absolutely no resemblance to the CHPC management, and particularly not what David really looks like in the office. In smaller clusters, for reasons of space, cost, simplicity, or whatever else, the management node and the head node are sometimes actually the same system. Much like you'd find in an enterprise mail server, it might also be the firewall server, or in a network, a DHCP server might also be the DNS server, and so on. Now let's take a look at one of the most critical components of a working cluster, the management node. This node manages the compute, or rather the actual production cluster components, and it also typically manages other components, both internal and external to the cluster system itself. In other words, the management server runs the show. If the management server isn't running properly, then the cluster itself won't be running properly. I assume most of you are familiar with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, so let's think of the management node as the leader of Marvel's Avengers. Not only does the leader of the Avengers have to keep the team working well together, like the management server would with the cluster components, the leader of the Avengers has to manage public relations. He has to coordinate meetings, drive the bus, have coffee with Nick Fury, organize party snacks, and find someone that's willing to share a room with Vision. And of course, I only say he, because as far as the Marvel Cinematic Universe goes, the leader is obviously Iron Man. Well, I mean, Captain America. No, Black Widow. Oh man, I mean woman. Okay, let's just move on. The head node is typically the first landing point for users onto the cluster. It bridges the gap between the external world and the isolated computer environment. Think of it like this. If you want to maximize performance in a project or an assignment, you want as few interruptions as possible so you can keep a rhythm and you can stay focused. And the cluster wants the same thing. So any users that want to connect to this cluster first talk to the head node. And the head node will do all the necessary network traffic between themselves and the client. It is very often referred to also as a login node, which is perhaps maybe a better description for its role. But if you hear the term head node, remember that also refers to a login node. One of the biggest trip-ups for newcomers to HPC is thinking that a head node is a management node. They are not actually the same thing. But in smaller clusters, for reasons as we've outlined before, the management node quite often is also assigned the role of the head node. Finally, the compute node is the dumb server that follows instructions issued by the management node. Whereas you might think of the management node as the brain of the HPC system, the compute nodes are simply brawn and muscle. In later chapters, we will go into more detail about how these various components of the cluster are configured, but for the most part, all HPC systems follow this basic template for their design.